Hi. Today I'll be talking about social impact assessment processes in Turkey. The title of our piece is The Analysis of Social Impact Assessment Processes Carried Out in Development Projects in Turkey. This piece is written by my colleague, Dr. Oltan Evcimen, and me, Koray Değirmenci. Let's look at our presentation now and we can proceed with that. Let's look at the abstract. Actually, one of the most significant challenges concerning development projects recently carried out in Turkey is this. Either environmental impact assessment and social impact assessment processes have not been fully implemented in accordance with international principles and norms, which is obliged by international financiers to raise funds to these projects, or the regulations to which these processes must adhere have fundamentally conflicted with the provisions of Turkish national legislation in some basic areas. The European Union signed international conventions that regulate the principles under which SIA and EIA processes are completed. Such rules are necessary to ensure developmental projects are considered sustainable, stable, and equitable by relevant international organizations, such as the International Finance Corporation, World Bank, and European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Moreover, the European Union requires that any country must adopt these international conventions before accession to the Union. Turkey neither signed the Aarhus Convention, which is the basic document outlining implementation principles of SIA and EIA processes, nor did it adapt national legislation to the Aarhus Convention and the Equator principles, the other main document regulating the principles of these processes. The conflict between the regulations dictated by SIA processes and provisions of the national legislation and the fact that SIA processes have not been carried out in full accordance with international standards have generated the following problems among others: retraction of funds by international financiers, unfinished projects, or attempted problem solving through superficial and inefficient measures taken long after a project's initiation. Furthermore, despite being central to the SIA process, inadequate implementation of democratic participation mechanisms, including active participation of the public, as well as non-governmental organizations, has generated a host of social problems. The basic assumption of this study is that while SIA and public participation processes implemented in accordance with international norms and principles formally uphold the principles of sustainability, stability, and equitability, they fail to represent successfully the socio-cultural, socio-economic, and socio-demographic specificities in Turkey. So let's look at the hypothesis of this work, and we have some hypotheses. First of all, SIA processes which have been developed and carried out within the framework of international norms and principles in Turkey since the beginning of the 2000s formally carry the governance principles of sustainability, transparency, participation, and egalitarianism. But Turkey is socio-cultural, socio-economic, and doesn't reflect their socio-demographic specificity. Second, since the international principles and norms that define the framework of the SIA processes in our country directly guide the SIA processes that require the specificity of a particular locality to be taken into account, they are insufficient to reflect that locality and to meet the needs. And third, even if the SIA and public participation processes are carried out in accordance with international norms and principles, the regulations required by these processes do not comply with the provisions of the national legislation. And as a result of this conflict, problems arise both in the project-specific and more comprehensive areas. And fourth of these hypotheses, Turkey's institutional capacity regarding SIA processes is insufficient for the implementation of SIA processes to be carried out in accordance with international principles and norms and the implementation of their results. So we can look at briefly the definition of SIA, and we can see that the technical approach of the SIA focuses on indicators that are relatively easy to measure, such as demographics, socioeconomic profiles, and employment. And political approach focus on more relative indicators, such as social welfare, political efficiency, economic sustainability, and sociological approach focus on indicators such as community ties, values, and cultural meaning codes. And we can we can regard social impact assessment as aiming to identify and measure the social impacts of developmental interventions on human settlements. However, the main function of the process is to maximize the positive effects and minimize the negative ones. And we can just refer to the Wenkley's definition, which is a prominent scholar in this field. For him, SIA is the design and implementation of planned interventions, such as policies, programs, plans, projects, and the designed or undesigned impacts on the human environment of any process of social change fueled by these interventions to create a more sustainable and equitable biophysical and human environment. So it's the process of analyzing, estimating, measuring, or considering and managing. So we can look at the states of SIA, and first of all, we have to describe the relevant human environment or affected area, and/or affected area, and develop an effective public plan to include potentially affected populations. And we have to identify other reasonable alternatives to the proposed action plan or policy. We should conduct studies to determine the full extent of possible social impacts. And we have to monitor to define the boundaries of the SIA process. And predicting reactions to social influences is another stage of SIA. And finally, we have to establish a monitoring plan and measure to eliminate negative effects of development projects. So we can just conceptualize the main themes of SIA by referring to Finsterbusch work, and these are population change, employment change, relocation and resettlement, local change, noise effect, aesthetic effects, excess change, change in leisure and recreational activities, health and safety, public reactions, community impact, and finally change in land use. Also, we can see that these impacts are very diverse. Some of them we can just think that it is very surprising to be appear there, but there are a lot of impacts and this is very multidimensional. So Bentley identifies the diversity of social impacts involved in the SIA process. And these are the following. The way people live, how they live, work, play, and interact with each other in their daily lives. And their culture, shared beliefs, customs, values, language, and accents. Communities, community ties, continuity, quality, services, and opportunities offered by that community. And political systems, the level of participation and democratization of people in decisions that affect their own lives. Their environment, the quality of the air and what water they use, the quality of the food they consume, and their level of access to these foods, the dangers and risks they are exposed to, the noise and pollution levels, the adequacy of sanitary cleaning, their physical safety, access to resources and control levels, well-being and health, and personal and property rights, especially if they have been economically affected and they have been subject to an impact on the violation of civil rights and freedoms. Fears and desires, concerns and perceptions about their safety, fears for the future of their community, and desires for the future of their children and themselves. As you can see, the impacts of development projects and impacts that SIA process deal with are very diverse, and we have to study very neatly and in detail to identify those impacts. They are interrelated, and sometimes they are many complicated relations between among them. And we can just look at the main problems that have arisen, that frequently arises during the implementation of SIA, and main problems within the definition of the process. First of all, there are no definitive tools for determining and eliminating the effects, and the process needs to be constantly questioned and developed. As we mentioned, there are some technical approaches that focus on indicators that are relatively easy to measure and precise. There are also some other approaches, for example, political approach and sociological approach, which are hard to identify, or sometimes there are that is very hard to define. And while approaches that take into account the active participation of the public and social and cultural specificities are increasing, the number of studies claiming that decision-making mechanisms tend to focus more on technical indicators and not operate public participation sufficiently. This point was shared by many scholars, prominent scholars in the field. And finally, the conduct of SIA processes, mostly by researchers, are done mostly by researchers who don't have sufficient experience and knowledge in social science methods. This observation was documented and discussed by many prominent scholars in the field as well. And you can just look at the conclusions of our study, and we want to focus more on Turkey in this part. In Turkey, the SIA process is applied superficially, completely devoid of the above-mentioned active nature of the EIA process, and with some legal regulations. The process was limited only to a public participation meeting, which constructs the participation in a completely passive sense and only for the purpose of informing the public. Secondly, the development projects in Turkey have recently been financed, not recently, but for about a few decades, have been financed by the private sector and foreign credit institutions, such as development banks. And the execution of SIA processes in accordance with international standards is a condition for providing international financing. Therefore, SIA processes in accordance with international standards have become a necessity. Thirdly, the basic criterion for financing development projects by international financial institutions is the principle of governance based on sustainability, transparency, participation, and egalitarianism. The basic condition for ensuring these governance principles is that the SIA and public participation processes are carried out actively and effectively in every project. And we can just define three main problems in SIA and public participation process in Turkey. First of all, the regulations required by the implemented SIA and public participation processes conflict with the provisions of the national legislation in many fundamental areas. We just observed this fact by looking at different development projects, as you can see from the presentation. I don't want to give details here, but you can just follow what these projects are and what are the main problems that have arisen from these projects. And second of these problems is that while the SIA and public participation processes determined by international conventions and principles should be carried out in coordination with feasibility and evaluation studies, the SIA processes carried out in these projects were included in the project in an eclectic manner after the project started. In other words, after the arrangements to be determined by SIA were made. And also we can give example from another project in Turkey. You can see the details in the presentation. And finally, these international SIA principles on which these SIA and public participation processes, which are thought to be made in accordance with international principles and conventions, are based, do not comply with Turkey's socio-cultural, socio-economic, and socio-demographic specificities, and are carried out in accordance with standard, that means imported procedures. Although these SIA processes have been formally made in accordance with international agreements, the conceptual sets used and the problems envisaged by these procedures do not comply with the social and cultural characteristics of our country and lead to the inability to predict and evaluate possible social problems at the project sites and to take effective measures against these effects. So we can look at the references that we used, that we benefited from in these works. And thank you for being interested in this study, and thank you for listening to our presentation.